Hello, Andrew here. Welcome to lecture 4 of the Designing Digital Content in Youth Work module. This lecture is on best practice youth work processes. What I really want to do here is, there's a lot of the theory is being discussed in other courses and will be discussed in later lectures or in the other creative multimedia for youth engagement module as well. So I just want to kind of bring it more towards this module is more about practical sort of more practical module with learning by doing and incorporating reflective practice in that. But I just want to reorientate a digital youth worker next to youth work models and theories, traditional ones and any emerging ones as well next to that. So that's what this will entail. So if we look at the kind of historically looking at youth work and the emergence of youth work models, of which there are many and varied ones. There's been a few movements to kind of have something more cohesive around that from a theoretical point of view, and also there's another push on that which we'll get at in the next slide. But essentially we're looking at good practitioners had an enormously complex and highly personal knowledge base constructed from experience, but used in a fairly intuitive way. So I suppose this kind of speaks to the volunteerism of youth work in one sense of having non-traditional or non-formal sorts of grounds, and that allowing these sort of varied multiples to arrive out of this. What we're really talking about here is just how kind of latent or hidden, or tacit rather than explicit, to use the term here, that knowledge base is, and how easily or readily that can be articulated and communicated in terms of a best practice model. So there's been a number of pressures kind of in more recent times put on this, in terms of just value for money sort of concepts, also just having a more cohesive sort of model. And then from youth workers, organizations themselves to really begin to explain the good work that is done in youth centers and in general with young people in these environments. So another side of that really we want to look at is the kind of, how much of it is a push and a shove and how much of it is a pull, I suppose, of, wanting to improve the quality of youth services and, have something more standardized in terms of being able to communicate sort of best practice. And the other is where it kind of chimes with, I suppose, policy and, different types of agenda towards that, or, notions of social control, even to stretch it that far. So that's just to kind of give a bit of a spectrum, which you've done, and you've gone into much more detail in other modules so far. So I just want to kind of, the other element of that really is from my perspective is in terms of digital youth work and the very nature of doing this type of work being that there's firm and perfect illustrations of the work you're doing, and you're kind of aggregating, iterating the work, designing it, redesigning it, and just kind of changing it, and all this being done from a youth-led sort of situation. Excuse me. So it's kind of closer to how, in traditional youth work, say, art workers would have worked, where there's a craft element, and again, the artifact is reduced, so you can look at that and use that as a reference of a kind of a sign of something having been achieved. Now it's in the domain with digital youth work that, this illustration of work should be there at every turn. And it's really just to kind of, point that out of, I suppose I'm going to come back to the idea of advocacy again later on. There's a slide on that just around, what is this youth work meant to entail? How much of it is to kind of justify the existence of youth work and, make sure that there's, funding streams continued. And it's fitting with like some sort of broader government policy, and how much of it has to do with kind of the origins of youth work, which is to essentially help young people towards, growing resilience, being, kind of independent and emancipated in their sort of, as they enter their early adult lives, essentially. So with all that in mind, we look at, models of critical social education, essentially, that can kind of, underpin a lot of this, and has done in a lot of regards. The interesting thing we see here is, this role of a social theory education being multidisciplinary, and having functions of, emancipatory functions. So if we just kind of do a quick rundown of what that might be, it's to promote a role of criticism in the search of quality education. So again, even in a simple basis, if we look at criticism, there's different types, be it in discourse or, discussion-based criticism. But a lot of the time, criticism, especially with young people, might have like, an illustration or an example or something to respond to, essentially. So again, digital media being a perfect environment for that, where we're looking at essentially media studies when it comes to, looking under the bonnet and really sort of starting to interpret and comprehend what is consumed in terms of media, rather than just kind of, absorbing it. The quality of this is proportional to the depth of analysis that students have at their disposal in education. So again, this is where, a youth work or a kind of non-formal environment can really step in, because if there's a will to kind of participate, well, then it's half the battle done, rather than kind of, having to force information into young people's heads, as a lot of young people would respond to, say, school and traditional school environments in this sort of sense. So youth work has a kind of a really interesting aspect of it there, that it can it can enable this sort of more informal sort of interaction with young people, and really get into an analysis of criticism, and like a deeper sort of level of thinking in relation to that. So also, as a critical form of classroom discourse, it cultivates students' ability to critique institutional as well as conceptual dilemmas, particularly those that leads to domination or oppression. So again, like, the school is, mandatory, and there's a set of rules to be followed there, and there is a set of kind of curriculum that need to be kind of adhered to. So all those things do have a certain sort of, rule breaking component for a lot of young people that, might be uncomfortable in that. Or likewise for, a teacher with a certain remit to deliver. Again, youth centres, although they have that in it, but it's a much more limited version of that, So again, there's that room, there's a lot of flexibility, and there's room, a bit of elasticity around the understanding of power, or the understandings of, authority around these sorts of things. And it's a much healthier, more fluid discussion in youth centres where it's youth-led than you may get in school environments like that. It promotes a language of transcendence that complements a language of critique. So, this is like, we're getting into optimum sort of states of it being a really involved, sort of immersed environment with that. And again, youth work, media, tech, emerging technology, all this sort of like, the internet, the World Wide Web alone, the multitude of resources that can be pulled on for any one aspect of this is now the digital youth workers' domain, to be able to kind of frame reference points next to all this sort of media that's available, and really challenge young people in terms of what they watch, how they watch it, what they consume, the amount of time they spend doing it, how much of that has a quality element next to how much of that is just sort of mere sort of mindless consumption of the same thing. And, all those things, again, delivering a critical social education around these sorts of ideas. So mostly overall, this all highlights the relationship between social systems and people, and ultimately how critical social theory can contribute to the emancipation of both. So in this sort of snapshot, we can see the interrelationship between the social systems, people, and all this arriving out of, like, we have the critical social theory, but also, this arriving out of the kind of the origins of youth work, and this sort of, working with individual young people first and foremost to build up resilience and different sort of critical thinking faculties towards a group environment, and then obviously extending outwards to social. Just another point to that end really is just the global nature and the World Wide Web element of these technologies does really kind of expand, where we have this sort of, a hyperlink and sort of a really accelerated culture that will extend from an individual in front of one device communicating or receiving information from the world and bypassing sort of group social scenarios or like immediate environments like that. So it's just kind of one of those really unique things that has emerged out of like new technologies in particular, and how people interact with them. And that's not necessarily a good thing in terms of how the people's understanding of social systems can be quite extreme as a result of that, I suppose, where you can look at some incredibly violent or extreme actions from the other side of the world and still not know what has gone on at the end of your road or in the next sort of village. So these are really kind of key concepts for a youth worker to start disentangling all that, and it becomes a really interesting sort of place to look at this critical social education around these same sort of issues. As David and Barry, this is just kind of pointing more towards this being in inevitables or in the offing, and definitely the real future concerns of the same thing. An active citizenry will be computationally enlightened one, and this kind of underpins a lot of stuff, and it does kind of recall a lot of what would have been discussed in the previous module around games in youth culture, digital rights, data rights, gamification, advocacy towards those ends, or potentials for exploitation. All those same ideas really come across from here as well, So in terms of, arriving at theory, best practice youth theory, there's kind of something interesting that happens then, because a lot of it is, we have, say with the Frankfurt School, more traditional media models of theory around more traditional analog media. And there's a really interesting thing happening where a lot of this is being kind of revised or repurposed into a digital context to see what's relevant or not, what's not, and how dynamic that can all be. This, along with the lines of people like Christian Fuchs and David Berry here, or in the last slide, is give a comprehensive scheme of the rapidly growing and unfurling academic and theory-based response to new and emerging tech. So you got this combination of the all Frankfurt School way of thinking with more kind of contemporary views like Chomsky, Zizek, Latour, Foucault in terms of power, Stuart Hall in kind of cultural studies, and then in more traditional senses of like critical in terms of critical thinking and like more non-traditional forms of education like Paulo Freire and Dewey. So there's a firm base, I suppose, that we can work from in terms of like what a digital youth worker might need as a frame of reference for best practice in terms of the youth work practice in a digital environment like that. And again, I just want to kind of remind us of the here we go. No, hold on. Yeah, just back to where we were in the last lecture of this sort of, hyperlinked resources. Again, I put it to CES one, where we see, there's this sort of link from theory to practice and, the sources, and this sort of hyperlinked world where in reality, it's never been easier to like access this sort of information as well and to pull on. And as I said, there's this resource is really useful, and it's focused from like a youth work perspective. So we look at a lot of the same theorists there who'd be looking at, different forms of learning and personal development in terms of empowerment models, right the way through to group, and then the more broader social stuff as well, So a mix of that sort of traditional sort of reading of youth work and theories around that, and like social theory, mixed with, digital revisionist stuff. And then also, just more sort of mass media sort of critiques or philosophers who would look at that in a much closer way. All combined with, like, again, from the previous module we would have seen, there's a real kind of emerging base of theory and kind of inquiry coming from digital games and emergent technology next to that, and the massive impact. And it's same with like digital labor, or labor rights and different sort of welfare rights, where there's a really interesting and dynamic sort of movement of thinking coming out in kind of opposition or in tandem with the massive unfurling sort of emerging technologies as well. So it's all quite vital, very interesting. There's any number of kind of, you know, frames of reference that can be given or like discussed in relation to this, and all that just leading to like a really rich environment for young people to kind of be confronted and really think about what they're engaging with and how they do it. So let's talk about the youth worker then, and go back to that word, the letter A word, advocate, which we've discussed on a number of occasions before. And it's that sort of like, this is kind of, a really important kind of emerging position, as I'm sure you're all aware of. And it's this idea, firstly, of like being an advocate for digital rights and emancipation of young people in the digital age, where, this idea of like, who is deciding, the first and earliest adopters of the technologies being the ones without any sort of set or any rights with that. So it's kind of vital that there's advocates on their behalf for like an inclusive and emergent bottom-up policy forming of that, rather than some sort of top-down moral panic-led sort of reactionary thing, which it could lead to more sort of social control or closing off avenues of things that haven't even been understood, and all that sort of, we can kind of all relate to that in one way, in terms of like any apprehension towards doing a course like this, for example, and thinking that there's like a massive, steep curve in terms of what needs to be understood or learned for that. And you can apply that to like your colleagues and other people in youth centres or your peer groups or like volunteer staff body, whichever, and sense that that's quite a palpable thing there in terms of, first, around confidence, secondly, around being secure and safe in the policy of a youth centre to engage in social media, for example, and like how much of that is like accessible, and the boundaries being quite unclear, where, the boundaries in traditional youth work are quite clear in terms of like appropriate kind of use and interaction of different sort of technologies or spaces when it comes to engaging with young people. So all those concerns are quite real, but I think they kind of cover a lot of that sort of the break in actually upskilling and just being fit for purpose in terms of working with young people who 9/10 of their lives is kind of a digital environment now, so it's kind of that's how massive a curve it is in terms of trying to engage and relate to young people, and essentially, it all arrives back at that sort of very direct human interaction that happens in traditional youth work. But we just have to understand the tools and the environment and the changing sort of culture and social state that young people are inhabit in this day and age, and all of that again, to be an advocate for, responsible for those cultural changes within the youth work setting, promoting and instilling that confidence, critical thinking and can-do attitudes is a vital role of the digital youth worker as well. So I just wanted to kind of point that out in terms of the frames of, all this stuff looks kind of heavy and like, it probably pressurized in some sense, but it's actually not. I find it's the opposite. It's the most interesting form of youth work that combines all these other, other aspects of youth work and culture and society that haven't before, and really addresses a need, which is the most important thing about youth work, where you can kind of, find a real support that can be given, and something quite dynamic that can help build strong relationships between young people and with young people in terms of like delivering that emancipation as we spoke of. So underlying all that, then it's very simple. I suppose I just put in this slide just to kind of show how things are a logical lead on, that to be creative and to create a digital world means being critical about it. So there's between having a frame of reference and giving frames of reference to work, and referencing different best practice, like it's essentially what you'd need to do if you want to create something which is impressive, or something really that young people would want ownership over or want to be part of, like that. So the concept of like doing iterations of that sort of work, negotiating collaborative processes, you know, taking responsibility for actions and over roles, things like this, referencing best practice, as we said, and then all building resilience and overcoming the obstacles and, like, you know, having to adapt and change, all with a view to having, you know, something at the end which is like a measure and, like, you know, a sign of all that has been achieved through the course of, like, you know, a particular program or a project-based piece of work like that. All of those things require a critical thinking and a different analysis underneath that. So between the actual process of making the work, there's a more latent and or more abstract way to, like, depersonalize it in one sense and really draw attention to, like, you know, a different type of set of problems. But mostly you're engaging young people in those faculties in how to critically think and problem solve in relation to that, and giving them any sort of number of environments to do that in. So it's kind of, you know, there's something quite intuitive about digital youth work and creative or visual arts related youth work, for example, when it comes to that, because it gives you that sort of space where you can conjure a third thing opposite for all the energy and all that sort of critical thinking to go towards. And that's it. And it's just back to the youth worker again, as student as much as advocate. And it's just something that I just wanted to put in terms of, like, just to address any sort of exasperation or wondering if this can be achieved or whatever. And, you know, and I think this is something that's going to chime right the way through youth work as a whole in years to come. And it runs the risk of, like, hypocrisy in some senses of the good things that we would espouse or, you know, hope or wish or look for or encourage young people to do. You know, a lot of youth workers, we essentially have to do it for ourselves now and apply it to ourselves. So if it is a difficult learning curve, or there's things to be, you know, uncovered or aware of or challenged by, or it's difficult and you have to build resilience in the face of it, the same way of speaking to young people about those very same things need to apply to youth workers now. And if we go right back along the line of, like, the history of youth work models and histories of volunteerism or, you know, activism in youth work or anything like that, that's kind of an interesting point, I suppose. And that's as far as I'd really want to go today, just to point out that there's another element there that needs to go into cultures and into society like that you know, I believe it can happen in youth centres, with digital youth work being, you know, one of the first sort of to pioneer, I suppose, one of the first platforms to pioneer this type of interaction and engagement, and confidently embracing a digital technological culture and society, and at the same time being, like, an advocate and active in defending of rights and, you know, renegotiating those sorts of terms in the virtual sort of domains. So just to go out on that, I just want to, the next few lectures I will be giving a few examples of, like, you know, just ideas that or video clips, I suppose, of critical thinking action, or little kind of corner, you know, references, I suppose, of, you know, where this and how this can happen. This one's from a long series which is based on a book by John Berger called Ways as Seen, and this kind of speaks more about the printed media, I suppose, but also he's speaking about it in, you know, in televised media as well. So it just kind of, I just want to lift the lid. The purpose of these videos, there won't be many in this lecture, in this module, but the purpose of these, I just want to lift the lid on a few things which are kind of assumed to be a certain way, and just to kind of give you a sense of what it's like to start allowing young people, or, you know, people in a programmed activity under the bonnet, really, and to have a look and really start to critically think and engage with stuff that they take for granted, I suppose.
Can be changed according to what you see beside it, can be changed according to what you see beside it, or what comes after it. Let's try a last experiment. We put the image of this well-known painting by Goya on your screen. You look at it in the context of what I'm saying, in the context of my image in relation to it. But supposing you had just turned onto this channel from one of the other two, then you might see something like this.
Some years ago, up in the mountains that were white with snow, inside a cabin, MacDougal, he was planning this gonna
And supposing now you turn off from the R channel onto one of the others. Each time, the impact of the Goya is modified. I've now emphasized the ways in which reproduction makes the meaning of works of art ambiguous. This is not as negative as it necessarily sounds if we realize what is happening. What it means, in theory, is that reproduction of works of art can be used by anybody for their own purposes. Images can be used like words. We can talk with them. Reproduction should make it easier to connect our experience of art directly with other experiences. You can sometimes see how naturally this begins to happen when, for instance, children or adults pin up reproductions alongside snapshots or their own drawings or pages from magazines. There, everything belongs to the same visual language, used for describing or recreating experience. What so often inhibits such a spontaneous process is the false mystification which surrounds art. For instance, the art book depends upon reproductions. Yet often, what the reproductions make accessible, a text begins to make inaccessible. What might become part of our language is jealously guarded and kept within the narrow preserves of the art.
Okay, so again, yeah, I just wanted I think that kind of explains a couple of things somewhat then, just in terms of the relationship between images. There's stuff that looks ambiguous, as you would have said there, of, you know, this sort of a sort of hidden set of things, or almost the spellbinding aspects of media, really, and how it can kind of work in certain ways like that, and how, you know, we all sense certain things from it and by it, but we don't really ever critically think about them or really engage with why that might be the case. And that's quite a sort of simple sort of scenario there, as described. I believe it, and anyway, I find that could be shown to, you know, or understood by everyone, especially young people in the, you know, mediated age now, where they're so media savvy with a lot of stuff. So there's, you know, those sort of elements of really getting under the bonnet and starting to look at stuff, how it's made and why it's made and how it's portrayed the way it is, and the effect and impact that can have. They're all sort of vital parts, and can really, you know, inform a lot of things for young people in particular, but for broader culture in general, of just not simply mass consumption of images and feeling strange or alienated by them, but to begin to understand it and kind of bring it closer. And I think he says it there again, you know, that sort of, once you understand it, it's not something to fear really, or it's not as dreadful as it seems. And that's, you know, all speaking to the same ends of like having a knowledge and our comprehension of things being a position of empowerment. And that's all somewhat vital to the discussions that we want to have in a digital media environment with young people. So the next lecture is going to push on a bit further with that, where we look at, you know, I thought I'd put that in there just in terms of like more traditional still arts and posters, just based on, you know, the kind of the print version of things we're doing now, or the 2D digital images. And then the next one we look at something related to, you know, just video and montage and how it happens, which is what he discussed there, of just the association next to things. So we get at those sorts of terms in the next lecture, really. So that's it. I'll either practical second half of the design of the poster, it will be part of this. Any questions on either of these things, please don't hesitate to send me an email, and see you in the next lecture.